family, and welcome back to Girl Get Up. For those that are new, we welcome you. I am your host, Jaira. Girl Get Up is a platform designed to educate, motivate, and inspire women in the urban community. Today, I asked a special friend of mine, can she come to join us to discuss the importance of being able to identify grief and being able to cope and deal with trauma. Today's guest is Miss Lisa Good, the founder of Urban Grief. I personally invited Miss Lisa Good to come sit with us and discuss the impact that trauma and grief have on our community. Miss Good, would you formally introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you for having me on your platform. I am the founder and director of Urban Grief, and Urban Grief is a trauma informed, healing centered program which offers grief crisis support, trauma support, and victim advocacy in the aftermath of violence in our community.
And what does that work look like?
Well, the work looks like doing a lot of outreach. When the weather permitted, we were definitely doing outreach, but it really looks like trying to get access to people who have been harmed and victimized in some way to offer them services so that they can recover and heal.
So, is that something that the community is open to? Have you seen people actually utilizing the services?
Well, I started Urban Grief probably like in 2001, and so initially it was with volunteers, and over time I found that the work really wasn't sustainable with volunteers just because it was so overwhelming. But I used that time to continue to engage with people individually and with families to keep providing that service and that resource. And what I learned in that process, that for our folks that access doesn't necessarily equal utilization, that sometimes we can get stuck on what we don't have, and then when we have it we don't necessarily utilize it. So there are people that are utilizing the services, but my hope from being on this platform with you today is that more people will know about what we have available and what services that we offer so that they can take advantage of it. But we do have people that are using the services. They're getting case management. They're getting assistance with OVS applications, that's Office of Victim Services. They're getting therapy um, and just information. Sometimes people just need a resource to just talk.
Well, for those of you that don't know, we are located in a 518, the capital of New York, Albany, and we have had a rise in gun violence. We have had a significant amount of laws that impacted our community. It affected us drastically. I personally know people that's been impacted by recent loss, whether it's been due to COVID, due to violence, accidents. Like, I feel like we've been losing people everywhere, and honestly, I feel like people within our community, we don't necessarily know how to cope with it, or we haven't been taught those skills, or we don't even know how to identify it a lot of times. And I feel like Miss Lisa Good is actually going to provide us with those skills and be able to explain and in depth what is trauma, what does it actually look like, what does it embody, even grief, what are the stages, where do you find the resources, how do you get the help. So, Miss Lisa Good, what is trauma?
So, there are a lot of different definitions of trauma, but the one that I like to use is kind of like a combination of definitions. And I want to read it because I
Please
think
do.
that I want people to kind of take in what I'm saying. Um, so the word trauma is used to describe experiences or situations that are outside of the normal experiences of everyday life that can cause a lot of stress, emotional pain, and distress. These events or situations sometimes involve horror, helplessness, serious injury, the threat of death. But these situations or events can also be dehumanizing in nature. And oftentimes there are elements of shock or terror. So the one thing about trauma is that it can be a singular event or it can be multiple events, right? Sometimes we think only in singular or we think that it's only event based, but some situations, are traumatic in nature, like poverty and racism and discrimination. So there's like traumatic elements, to that. So it's not just event based, but it can also be situational, so to speak. But the thing that really sticks out for me is that it overwhelms your normal sense or pattern of coping. So I think that we all have our own style, so to speak. I call it our theme music, right? We have our own way of managing difficulties and crises, and we have a toolbox, and that our toolbox is given to us by our family of origin, right? And then by the time we get to be a preteen, we start to take on the tools of our friends and our peers. And then by the time we're a teenager, yes, we have that those foundational tools and ways of managing things that we may have picked up, from our family. But a large portion of our tools and how we cope and deal do come from our peer circles. But also those tools and how we manage and navigate through difficulty also it's influenced by society and what society says is normal and how you should feel and how you should respond. And so, when you encounter something that is traumatic, if your perception of that event is traumatic and it involves horror and threat and a lot of distress and just being overwhelmed, and your coping tools or your box is underwater and it's not working, then for you that's a traumatic event. And I think that when I think of it as a whole, is that it's something that really kind of overwhelms your cognitive, your physical, your emotional, and behavioral mechanisms for coping and managing. And um, when you hit that place, then that's what we call trauma, or you've experienced something traumatic. And so how that looks for people is different, but sometimes it involves the thinking patterns, but it also involves the stress response, where people are propelled into the fight, flight, or freeze response. And so everybody you know lives that out in a different kind of way, right? Um, but for black and brown people, we don't just have the trauma or traumatic experiences that come from, living in our communities, but we also have the historical trauma from racism and slavery and segregation and all of the racialized events that we are dealing with, especially in 2020. Um, but we have that portion of it, um, as well. And so sometimes, you know, we come into our life experiences, you know, fast forward, so to speak, and we're not just dealing with the trauma of the here and now events, but we have this historical trauma that we carry as black and brown people. But then we also have all of these other types of experiences, whether they're in our family or in our neighborhoods, that can also be traumatic. And so a lot of times we're not just dealing with one event, we're dealing with a lot, and it's more complex. And there is a term for that. They call it complex trauma. Why? Because it has a long term and deep impact on people, how they think, how they function, how they do relationships, and how they're able to live their lives.
So how can we identify that? So how can a person looking in the mirror and say, this is me, or like I faced this traumatic experience, now I'm dealing with the aftermath. Like, what does that aftermath look like after the experience?
I think it looks different for different people, although there are some similarities. Um, one of there's one definition of trauma that talks about how your sense of safety is ruptured. Your sense of safety and security is ruptured. Um, that the lasting impact, and I mean, I think that sometimes it's just being willing to be honest with yourself. Now, there are situations where you have experiences and you're kind of not sure, but for the most part, people generally know where those points or those markers are, where something happened, or and whether they witnessed it or they experienced it directly. Because that's another piece of it, is that it's not always just about what happens to us. It's also about what happens to the people that we care about and love. Um, but I think that people oftentimes know that point in time where that event or that situation happened, and they can trace back to, that was the moment where I stopped caring about anybody. That was the moment I started hating myself. That was the moment I gave up on school, or that was the moment that I couldn't sleep any longer, and so I started getting high just so I could function in the day. Or that was the moment where I made a decision and nobody was ever going to run up on me again. I was going to have something to defend myself. So I think that you know if we're honest with ourselves, or if we are willing to let other people be honest with us, okay? Because sometimes our friends and our families, they know that something is wrong. They can, because sometimes we don't always remember. Um, but they know, and sometimes if we're willing to let people be honest with us, they could say, "You remember when you was in that relationship and we didn't like him? That's because he was abusing you." And you're like, "No, he wasn't. That was
Mm-hmm.
not an abusive relationship, because I would not have put up with that." Well, yeah, girl, you did. But you did. You know what I'm saying? And I think that is, sometimes we kind of, we toughen up, so to speak, as a way to insulate ourselves from the reality of what we have experienced. So it's kind of like, well, I wasn't abused because I fought back.
Right. Oh, I've heard that before.
Oh, I'm not abused. He ain't abusing me. We go blow for blow. Well, really? How many of them rounds did you actually win?
Right.
Like, and what does that look like? And isn't that in and of itself problematic,
Right.
right? And so I think that that's an example. If you go somewhere and you have a sexual encounter with someone, you consent for a sexual encounter with one person, and then it turns into multiple people, right? And then you're like, well, look, I know what I'm doing, because but still, was that not traumatic? And maybe your friends are saying that wasn't right. I heard, or I
Mm-hmm.
saw, or I told you, afterwards something was wrong with you, and you was like, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good, right? And so I think that sometimes we know, but we don't want to know. But then also the people around us have information that can help fill in the blanks and help us to see and identify. And that's not the parts that we necessarily want to hear. Sometimes another way that we can tell is just look at some of our habits, and
Mm-hmm.
ask yourself, where did that habit come from? I can't remember where I heard this. I don't know if it was, I can't remember if I just, it was something recent, but it was a lady, and she was talking about how every when she was growing up, her grandmother always put a towel, like like rolled up a towel and put it at the bottom of the door. And so when she got older, she did the same thing too, but she didn't understand why, why are we doing that? And ultimately, the towel rolled up at the door is so that if she woke up in the middle of the night and that towel was moved, she could tell whether, her uncle or whoever had been in her room and had violated her in some way. Um, and so
Oh
sometimes,
wow.
right, right. So sometimes I think that if we can trace back, like think about some of our little habits and idiosyncrasies, or even some of the messages that we were given by our family members about where to go, where not to go, who to be with, who not to be with. I think those can give us like clues, so
Hmm.
to speak.
And if they're able to identify those clues, what would be their next step? Like, would it be like a healing process, or what would that look like?
I think the first step is just, so in my work, we talk about trauma informed, right? And so trauma informed has a framework for practice in the delivery of services. Really says, instead of saying, "What's wrong with you?"
Hmm.
what happened and what's happening for you. And that elicits a different kind of conversation. And so I think that it begins with, um, acknowledging, what happened, and then, sharing that with someone who is safe and trustworthy, and and unpacking and looking at all of the ways that your life has changed or was impacted in a negative way, but also looking at all of the ways that you were successful as well, and navigating that. And one of the things that I want to just say is that sometimes we judge one another in our community. We look at this person over here and we say, "Oh, they got it going on because they went to college, they did this, they did that, they did this." And and they got all of the outward trappings of success, right? And then we look at this person over here, and you're like, "I don't know what's wrong with her." And look at him, and they did this and they're doing that, and they just making a mess, and they got all these kids and doing, all these other kinds of things. And we say, okay, this person over here probably has a lot of baggage and trauma, right? But this person over here, because they are able to put together, um, um, and and do some of these milestones that people look as a role model or a success, that sometimes we don't necessarily see the trauma of this group, this other group. But what happens in our community is we pit each other against one another, as one being better than the other, when if we were honest that, whether you were over here from this zip code uptown or over here from this zip code downtown, that, or or whether you lived out in the suburbs, that trauma is trauma.
Oh.
Okay. That trauma is trauma. And that, um, the pervasive nature of trauma experiences in our society, it crosses a it crosses a it cuts across class and race lines. However, there are certain groups that are more disproportionately impacted by traumatic events. But I see that all the time. Like there's this judging about this person over here, and I'm like, look, boo, I know both your stories, and they're actually the same.
Hmm.
You know
A
what I'm
lot of times
saying?
there are
They
like.
are they really are very similar. And sometimes the difference could be is that maybe this person had a caring adult or someone to guide them, and even though that adult didn't know what was going on in their life, that there were other people, whereas maybe this person over here didn't have anyone to help guide them. um, Maybe there was access to other resources. But we all have pain, and I think that part of how we deal with our pain, um, um, can draw us closer together, or it can divide us further apart. And I see a lot of I see more of how it divides us apart as opposed to drawing us together. I think it's now starting to maybe draw people together, but I still think that there are so many untold stories that people have that they don't share, that they can't share out of fear, out of shame, out of guilt. Because, like you said, to your point, that once I identify it, what do I do with it next? So I identify it, I look at, and I'm open to looking at all of the ways that it's impacted my life, and then saying, you know what, I want to do something different in this moment, um, with what I've experienced.
So at that moment, should they reach out to other resources, maybe get engaged with therapy, group counseling?
I think so. I mean, um, it depends on the extent, of the impact. I think people have different needs, but I do think that therapy can offer people a safe place where they can unpack things. They can gain some, excuse me, they can gain some clarity about what they have experienced. They can learn some coping skills because a lot of our self destruction emerges from the, the, the fact that we don't have coping skills, that we don't have a healthy outlet, um, for our pain and our grief where we are seen, we are heard, and we are valued, right? And where there is compassionate accountability. And I think that being seen, being heard, being valued, and having compassionate accountability, in a therapeutic setting, um, is a great place to begin that healing journey.
I agree. I'm in therapy, and it actually, me and my whole family is in therapy, my kids and everything. But I definitely feel like after starting my journey in 2016, when I first started therapy, to start my healing, it definitely has been effective. And I encourage it. I'm a major advocate for therapy. Everyone knows that on all my platforms, even in my personal life. I encourage it, family, friends, everyone. At least even if it's just to open us up and get us comfortable with communicating and expressing ourselves, because I feel like within our culture too, a lot of times with children, our parents tell us, "Be quiet, you stay in a child's place. Someone's talking to you." So we learn to close our voice down, like we go mute. And then as adults now, we still don't express how we feel. So I definitely feel like therapy helped with the whole communicating. So go to therapy.
Absolutely. I mean, we're never too old to learn, new skills. People see me now and they're like, oh, whatever, what. But really, it wasn't until I went to counseling and I stuck with it that I really kind of got, clear. I remember, I want to say, probably the first time I went to counseling or to therapy was probably when I was maybe like, I don't know, I want to say maybe 15, somewhere in there, 16, somewhere in there, maybe 15. And, I still remember her name. Her name was Carol Francis. Hi, Carol. She worked at Whitney Young. That's access, right? Accessibility. She worked at Whitney Young. I can't even remember how I started going there. I don't know. Maybe I had tried to kill myself or something.
Do Whitney Young still provide those services?
I don't know.
I'll have to follow up. I'll let you guys know that. It'll be on our page.
I'm sure that they do, but I don't know. But back then it was very different.
Mm-hmm.
See, you gotta understand that when Whitney Young was built in our community, it was the state of art for medical care. It was the place that we wanted to go and get our medical care. I never remember seeing a doctor outside of Whitney Young. That was the place where we wanted to be. The people that worked there looked like us. We wanted to be at Whitney Young. People from the community worked there. We wanted to be at Whitney Young. I remember that. I remember that, and and so it was a natural place, to go. And like I said, I can't remember exactly how I got there. Sure, my parents had to be involved in some way or whatever, but I wanted to be there. Um, and I remember going and seeing my counselor, and I was working on my self esteem because it's a pretty generic issue, right? I need to work on my self esteem, but that wasn't the real issue. But I think that if I, if I had continued, we would have got to the real issue, right? But it was still an outlet. It was someplace that I felt safe, I felt comfortable, that where I could go and and talk. So that part of the journey gets terminated. I'm out there wilding, just being crazy. I was a mess. Okay, you got to understand. I was a mess. I took my parents through. I was a mess. I was the person that would go to the store. You wouldn't see me for a week. Okay,
I thought you might say a couple hours.
Nah, fam. I was the one that would go to the store. You wouldn't see me for a week, okay? I'm gonna walk up to the corner store up here on Larkin, Washington. Go get me a pint of 151. We about to hit these streets and make it do what it do. And I was just so, but it was a response to pain. It was a response to pain, and I think that with our young people in particular, we underestimate the pressure and the weight that they carry in their lives silently and secretly. We underestimate the weight and the pressure of breakups and relationships. We underestimate the betrayals that come because betrayal is very traumatic. So imagine being with someone you're young and this person is your first, right? And then you find out that they're doing it with your best friend.
Devastating.
What? Devastating, right? So I think that we underestimate those kinds of things. But yeah, so you fast forward it a few years, and I just ended up, my life just ended up spiraling, multiple suicide attempts. And I think it wasn't probably until I left the area when I was like 19 that I kind of started to think a little bit differently um, about what I had been through and what I wanted to do with that. But then I got married, and that relationship was abusive, and that was a secret, right? That the abuse was a secret, and I almost died, in that particular situation. But you know, because we're taught that you deal with things, you handle it, you get a job, you take care of your kid, you do this, you do that, you go to college, you do, and I did all of those things all the while being abused, right? And it wasn't until that